Have you ever had a moment where the hair on the back of your neck stands up and your gut screams at you to run? We like to think we understand the world around us, that we are safe in our homes, our cars, and our routines. But the truth is, the world is vast, dark, and full of things that defy explanation. Today, we are diving into the deep end of the unknown. These are 10 horrifying, mind-blowing stories that will make you question what is hiding just out of sight. Turn off the lights, lock your doors, and whatever you do, do not look out the window. Story number 1. The Appalachian Trail stretches for over 2,000 miles, winding through some of the oldest, deepest woods in North America. It is a place of breathtaking beauty, but also intense, crushing isolation. In the late fall of 2019, a seasoned hiker named David decided to tackle a notoriously remote section of the trail in the high elevations of North Carolina. The canopy above was thick, blocking out the sun and casting the forest floor into a permanent, gloomy twilight. The air was biting cold, carrying the sharp scent of decaying pine needles and damp earth. He hadn't seen another human soul, not even a footprint in the mud, for 3 entire days. As dusk approached on the 4th day, the shadows grew impossibly long, and the temperature began to plummet rapidly. He began scanning the dense underbrush, looking for a flat, dry place to set up camp for the night. He pushed through a thicket of thorny bushes and found a small, unnatural-looking clearing just off the main path. The ground here was oddly barren, stripped of the usual ferns and moss. As he dropped his heavy pack, rolling his aching shoulders, he noticed something strange partially obscured by the gloom. Tucked behind a thick, tightly packed grove of dead, gray pines was an old, rotting wooden cabin. It wasn't on his topographical map, nor had it been mentioned in any of the trail guides he had obsessively studied. The structure sagged heavily in the center, the roof partially caved in under the weight of decades of rot. The wood was black and blistered, looking almost as if it had been scorched by a fire long ago. But the most unsettling detail was the windows. They were completely blacked out. As David stepped a few feet closer, his boots snapping dry twigs that sounded like gunshots in the quiet woods, he realized they weren't just dark inside. They had been coated with what looked like thick, congealed tar, applied frantically from the inside to keep something out, or perhaps to keep something in. David felt a sudden, heavy dread settle like a stone in his stomach. Every instinct he had honed over years of backcountry survival screamed at him to keep walking, to put miles between himself and that structure. But the wind was picking up, howling through the dead branches, and the sun had completely dipped below the horizon. Reluctantly, he decided to set his tent up near the tree line on the absolute farthest edge of clearing, keeping a safe distance from the rotting walls. He ate a cold, tasteless dinner of dried rations, unable to bring himself to light a fire that might draw attention. He zipped himself tightly into his sleeping bag, the nylon feeling flimsy and exposed, and closed his eyes, praying for sleep. Around 2 a.m, the temperature had dropped below freezing. David woke up with a violent start, his breath plumed in the freezing air inside the tent. He listened. It wasn't the wind howling through the valley, and it wasn't the heavy footfalls of a foraging bear. It was a rhythmic, wet thumping coming directly from the direction of the blackened cabin. Thump, a pause of exactly 3 seconds. Thump, another pause. Thump. It sounded like a massive piece of raw meat being slapped against the hollow wooden floorboards. He lay completely frozen, his eyes wide in the pitch-black tent, straining his ears until they rang. Then, the wet thumping stopped entirely. The silence that followed was suffocating. It was quickly replaced by a low, vibrating humming sound. It sounded almost human, like a choir singing a single, sustained, atonal note, but there was a metallic, buzzing quality to it that made the fillings in David's teeth ache and his skull throb. Slowly, with trembling fingers, he reached for the zipper of his tent. He pulled it down just an inch, wincing at the tiny metallic rasp, and pressed his eye to the gap to peer out into the clearing. Standing in the pale, washed-out moonlight, about 10 feet from the thin fabric of his tent, was a figure. It was impossibly tall, easily standing over 7 feet, its limbs stretched and thin like a starving animal. It was wrapped entirely in filthy, dark rags that seemed to writhe and shift in the wind, smelling strongly of stagnant water and old copper. But the most terrifying part, the image that would be burned into David's mind for the rest of his life, was its head. Where her face should have been, there was nothing but a smooth, pale, fleshy surface, reflecting the moonlight like dull porcelain. There were no indentations for eyes, no ridge for a nose, no slit for a mouth. Yet, the deep, vibrating humming was coming directly from it, radiating from the skin itself. David didn't breathe. He felt his lungs burning, but he refused to inhale. He didn't blink, terrified that if he closed his eyes for a fraction of a second, the entity would be inside the tent. The figure stood completely motionless for what felt like hours, a statue of pure nightmare. Its blank, featureless face pointed directly at the tiny gap in the tent door. Then, moving with a horrifying, smooth grace that defied its ragged appearance, it silently turned. It didn't take steps. It simply glided over the frost-covered grass back toward the cabin, melting into the absolute blackness of the tree line. David didn't sleep for the rest of the night. He sat upright, clutching his bear spray, shaking violently until the sky finally turned a bruised purple. At the first sign of dawn, he packed his gear in a frantic blur, leaving his tent stakes in the frozen ground, and practically ran the 15 miles of treacherous terrain to the nearest logging road. He never spoke of what he saw, and he never, ever went back to the woods. Story number 2. The night shift at a lonely, run-down gas station on a deserted, crumbling stretch of Route 66 in Arizona is about as quiet and isolating as a job can get. The landscape is flat, barren, and stretching endlessly in every direction, completely devoid of civilization. For Sarah, a 22-year-old college student drowning in student loans, the graveyard shift from midnight to 8 a.m. was the perfect place to get paid minimum wage to study for her nursing exams. It was a Tuesday night in late November. The desert air outside was freezing, biting through the thin glass of the storefront. Inside, the fluorescent lights hummed a relentless, annoying buzz. It was completely dead. Not a single pair of headlights had passed by on the dark highway in over 3 hours. Around 3:15 a.m., the silence was finally broken. The harsh, brass bells on the front door jingled loudly, making Sarah jump in her seat. She looked up from her heavy medical textbook, her eyes bleary, expecting to see a tired, coffee-starved long-haul trucker or a lost tourist. Instead, a woman walked in. She was dressed in a pristine, bright yellow, lightweight summer dress, a garment completely, bizarrely out of place for the freezing, 30-degree desert night. Her blonde hair was perfectly, immaculately styled, not a single strand out of place despite the wind outside, and she wore a wide, fixed, closed-lipped smile that stretched unnaturally across her face. She walked stiffly, her arms pinned rigidly to her sides, making a beeline straight down the center candy aisle. Her high heels clicked loudly and rhythmically against the cheap, scuffed linoleum floor. Clack, clack, clack. Sarah felt a prickle of unease but forced on her best retail voice, offering a polite, "Welcome in. Let me know if you need help finding anything." The woman didn't acknowledge her. She didn't blink. She just stood at the very end of the aisle, facing away from Sarah, staring blankly at the beige, undecorated wall next to coolers. 1 minute passed, then 5, then 10 long, agonizing minutes. The clicking of the heels had stopped entirely, and the heavy silence in the brightly lit store became thick and suffocating. Sarah could hear the blood pumping in her own ears. Sarah nervously cleared her throat, her voice trembling slightly, and asked again, "Ma'am, do you need help finding the restrooms or maybe some water?" The woman slowly began to turn her head. Not her shoulders, not her torso, just her head, twisting on her neck at a sickening, uncomfortable angle until she was looking directly backward over her shoulder at Sarah. That wide, unnatural smile never faltered for a second, but as she faced the counter, Sarah saw her eyes. They were completely black, not just dark brown in the poor lighting, but entirely devoid of white iris or pupil, resembling two deep, glossy pools of spilled ink. When she finally spoke, her lips barely moving, her voice sounded like an auditory nightmare. It sounded like two completely different people, one a high-pitched woman, one a deep, raspy man, talking at the exact same time, slightly out of sync with one another, creating a horrifying echo effect. The dual voice said, "They're looking for you outside." Sarah's blood ran ice cold. A wave of nausea hit her, so hard she had to grip the edge of the counter to stay standing. She instinctively glanced past the woman, looking through the large, smudged glass windows at the front of the store. The parking lot was completely empty, bathed in the harsh, flickering glare of the lone sodium street lamp. There were no cars, no people, just the wind blowing dust across the asphalt. It took her only a second to scan the lot. When she snapped her gaze back to the aisle, the woman was gone. The space where she had been standing was completely empty. There was no sound of the heavy glass door opening, no chime of brass bells, no click of high heels running away. She had simply vanished into thin air, shaking uncontrollably, tears streaming down her face. Sarah crawled over the counter, locked the front doors with shaking hands, and barricaded herself inside the cramped, windowless back office, clutching a pair of scissors until the morning manager arrived at 7 a.m. When they pulled up the security footage to report the incident, the tape showed a chilling reality. It showed Sarah looking up from her book, staring intensely down a completely empty aisle for 10 minutes, her face draining of color, and then speaking frantically to thin air. Story number 3. Urban exploration can be a thrilling, adrenaline-fueled hobby, unearthing forgotten history hidden in plain sight, but it carries immense, unseen risks. You never know what structural hazards, toxic chemicals, or unstable people you might face when you cross into forgotten corners of the world. In the decaying, forgotten Rust Belt of Ohio, a tight-knit group of 3 friends, Mark, Chloe, and Dan, dedicated their weekends to finding exactly these places. After months of scouring old municipal blueprints, they located an undocumented, Cold War-era underground bunker complex hidden deep beneath the sprawling ruins, an abandoned, rust-eaten steel mill. It took them an hour of dangerous descent, climbing down rusted, flaking metal ladders, an army crawling through cramped, suffocating concrete drainage pipes just to reach the main subterranean level. The air down there was incredibly stale and thick, tasting metallic, full of iron oxide, damp earth, and deep decay. Their high-powered LED flashlights cut sharp, narrow beams through the absolute, crushing darkness, revealing a massive, cavernous space. Long, brutalist concrete hallways stretched out like a maze, lined on both sides with heavy, blast-proof steel doors. The silence was absolute, a heavy pressure against their eardrums. They agreed in hushed whispers to stick close together, not wanting to get lost in the labyrinth. They approached the first door on the left, straining together to push the heavy, groaning hinges open. The room inside was an old communications hub, a perfect time capsule of paranoia. It was filled floor to ceiling with ancient, reel-to-reel radio equipment, massive switchboards and military dials, all covered in a thick, undisturbed, gray velvet layer of dust. It was fascinating, a holy grail for urban explorers. But as Dan was adjusting the flash on his camera to take pictures of the control panel, a sudden, violently sharp sound echoed to the concrete bunker, bouncing off the walls. It was a high-pitched mechanical ring. They froze instantly, the blood draining from their faces. Dan nearly dropped his camera. The sound was impossible. It was coming from a bright, cherry-red, rotary telephone sitting on a dented metal desk in the far, darkest corner of the room. A phone that hadn't been connected to a power grid, a switchboard, or an active phone line in well over 50 years. Yet it kept ringing, a harsh, grating mechanical demand that sliced through the silent tomb like a knife. Ring. Pause. Ring. Chloe started backing toward the door. Her breathing panicked, begging them in a frantic whisper to leave right now. But Mark, always the skeptic, driven by a morbid, reckless curiosity, slowly walked over to the desk. The ringing seemed to grow louder with every step. He hesitated for a long, agonizing moment, staring at the dust-covered plastic before slowly reaching out, picking up the heavy receiver and bringing it to his ear. He didn't say hello. He didn't speak at all. He just listened to whatever was on the other end. Chloe and Dan watched as the color instantly drained from Mark's face, leaving him deathly pale, his eyes wide with terror they had never seen in him before. His hand began to shake violently. He dropped the phone. The heavy receiver clattered loudly against the metal desk, dangling by its coiled cord. Mark turned to them, his voice barely a choked whisper, and said, "We have to run, right now." He didn't wait for them to process it. He shoved past them, sprinting blindly out of the communications room and back into the pitch-black tunnels, his flashlight beam bouncing erratically against the concrete. Chloe and Dan chased after him, their hearts pounding wildly in their chests, terrified of whatever he was running from. When they finally made it back to the crawl spaces and up the rusted ladders to the surface, gasping for fresh, cold air in the ruins of the steel mill, they collapsed. Chloe, crying, demanded to know who was on the phone and what they had said. Mark looked at them, tears streaming to the dirt on his face, his eyes hollow, and said, "It was my own voice. It sounded older, and it told me to lock that heavy steel door from the outside and leave you two down there in the dark forever." Story number 4. The ocean is the last true frontier on Earth, a massive, crushing expanse of black water that hides things we can't even begin to comprehend, things that belong in nightmares. For Marcus, a master cave diver with 20 years of intense, specialized experience, the sprawling, claustrophobic underwater caves off the coast of Florida were his sanctuary, his second home, but he respected them. He knew the absolute, unforgiving risks. Cave diving is a zero margin for error sport. One tiny mistake, one equipment failure, one misplaced fin kick that stirs up a cloud of blinding silt, and you are trapped in a pitch-black, watery tomb forever. On a calm Tuesday morning, Marcus and his trusted dive partner, Elena, descended into a newly discovered, unmapped sinkhole, intending to push the boundaries and chart a virgin limestone tunnel system. The water in the upper cavern was beautiful, crystal clear for the first 100 feet, illuminated by shafts of sunlight from the surface. But as they swam deeper, leaving the light behind and relying entirely on their battery-powered torches, the environment grew hostile. They had to squeeze through a narrow, jagged limestone restriction known as a choke, a passage so tight they had to turn their heads sideways to fit their helmets through. Just as Marcus pushed his shoulders to the gap, the subterranean current suddenly and violently shifted. It was unprecedented, a massive surge of water tearing through the tunnel like a freight train. It violently ripped the nylon guideline, their only map back to the surface, right out of Marcus's gloved hand. In a matter of seconds, the rushing water kicked up a massive, impenetrable cloud of blinding white clay silt from the cave floor. It was an instant, complete whiteout, zero visibility. Marcus couldn't even see the gauges strapped to his own wrist. Fighting down the rising panic, he immediately stopped moving and signaled for Elena, sweeping his powerful dive light in a wide arc to the impenetrable murk, waiting for the familiar, answering flash of her beam. There was nothing, just swirling white chaos. He forced his breathing to slow, following emergency protocol. He pressed his body against the cold, jagged rock wall, blindly feeling his way along the sharp limestone, praying his heavy neoprene glove would brush against a thin nylon guideline. Minutes ticked by in agonizing slow motion. Every breath sounded deafening in his regulator. He checked his pressure gauge. His air supply was dropping dangerously low. Then, through the thick, swirling silt, maybe 20 feet ahead, he saw it, a faint, rhythmic flashing light cutting through the gloom. 1, 2, 3, pause. 1, 2, 3. It was a universal emergency signal. Relief washed over him in a massive wave. It was Elena. He kicked his fins, swimming cautiously toward the glowing beacon. As he got closer, the silt began to settle just a fraction, clearing enough to make out the silhouette of a figure in a black wetsuit, holding a high-powered dive torch. But as the distance closed to 10 feet, Marcus realized something was horrifyingly wrong. The figure wasn't suspended in the water, swimming. It was standing perfectly, unnaturally upright on the cave floor, its bare, pale feet planted firmly in the deep mud. It wasn't wearing buoyancy fins. It wasn't wearing the heavy steel air tanks required to breathe at this depth. And as Marcus drifted closer, shining his own powerful light directly onto the figure's face, his heart stopped in his chest. A jolt of pure, paralyzing terror locked his muscles. The creature wasn't wearing a diving mask. It didn't have dive gear at all. The face staring back at him through the murky water was pale, horribly bloated like a drowned corpse, and it was smiling. It was a wide, impossible smile that stretched far past the bounds of human jaw, revealing row after row of translucent, needle-like teeth. The creature slowly raised a hand. Its fingers were impossibly long, gray and webbed with thick skin. Held loosely in its monstrous grip was a dive light. Elena's dive light. The creature looked right into Marcus's eyes and casually clicked the button. It flashed the light 3 times. 1, 2, 3. Marcus didn't think. Instinct took over. He panicked. He blindly scrambled backward, kicking wildly against a rock, tearing his wetsuit, miraculously slamming into the main tunnel wall and tangling his arm in the lost guide line. He pulled himself hand over hand, blindly dragging himself through the choke, and made it to the surface gasping, vomiting seawater, with less than 2 minutes of breathable air left in his tank. Massive search and rescue operations were launched, but Elena was never found. However, the recovery divers who searched the deepest, unmapped sections of the tunnels the next day reported something deeply unsettling. Coming from the blackest depth of the cave, far beyond where human lungs could reach, they heard a strange, metallic, rhythmic tapping echoing through the water. Story number 5. There's a specific, creeping kind of dread that comes with driving alone on a deserted highway in the absolute dead of night. The heavy darkness presses in on the edges of your headlights, creating a hypnotic, suffocating tunnel effect that plays nasty tricks on an exhausted mind. In the bitter, freezing winter of 2018, a freelance photographer named Sarah was making a grueling cross-country drive from Chicago to Seattle for a gallery showing. She preferred driving the night shifts to avoid the chaotic daytime traffic, keeping herself fueled and awake with bitter black coffee and a playlist of true crime podcasts. Around 2:30 a.m., she was crossing a particularly desolate, flat stretch of Interstate 90 in rural South Dakota. The world outside her windows was nothing but pitch black, frozen, empty fields. She hadn't seen the taillights of another car for over 40 miles. The road was a lonely black ribbon. Then, she glanced in her rearview mirror and noticed a pair of headlights. They were distant at first, just 2 dim pinpricks of yellow light hovering in the vast blackness miles behind her. But they were closing in fast, unnaturally fast. Within a matter of minutes, the vehicle had eaten up the distance and was tailgating her so incredibly closely that she couldn't even see its headlights in her mirror anymore. All she could see was a massive, dark, rusted chrome grille of a large, older model heavy-duty truck filling her entire rear window. It was so close she could feel the vibration of its massive engine through the floorboards of her small sedan. Annoyed and slightly nervous, she gently tapped her brakes, flashing her red lights, hoping the aggressive driver would take the hint and back off. The truck didn't flinch. It maintained its bumper-to-bumper position. Sarah gripped the steering wheel tighter, her knuckles turning white, and pressed the accelerator, pushing her speed up to 80 miles an hour. The massive truck matched her speed perfectly, effortlessly, continuing to hover mere inches from her rear bumper. Her heart began to hammer a frantic rhythm against her ribs. The nearest exit was 30 miles away, and there were no gas stations, no houses, no lights anywhere. She was entirely alone with this metallic stalker in the frozen wasteland. Panic rising in her throat, she made a snap decision to pull over to the narrow gravel shoulder, hoping to God the driver was just an impatient jerk who would blow past her in the passing lane. She hit her right blinker, slowed down, and slowly eased off the asphalt, the frozen gravel crunching loudly under her tires. The truck didn't pass. It immediately pulled over right behind her, its massive, roaring engine idling so loudly it shook the glass of her windows. Sarah slammed the locks down on all 4 doors, unbuckled her seatbelt, and frantically fumbled in the dark for her cell phone, her hands shaking violently. She looked at the screen. No service, not a single bar. She stared into the rearview mirror, her breath catching in her throat, as she watched the driver's side door of the massive truck slowly creak open. A tall, broad-shouldered man stepped down onto the gravel. He was wearing a heavy, dark winter parka. The fur line had pulled up so low it completely obscured his face in shadows. But he didn't start walking toward her window. Instead, he slammed his heavy door shut and turned his back completely to her car. Slowly, deliberately, and with horrifying precision, he began to walk backward toward her vehicle. His movements were completely wrong. They were jerky, unnatural, and stiff, almost like a poorly animatronic robot trying to mimic a human stride. He took step after backward step until he reached the trunk of her car. He stopped dead. He stood there perfectly, unnaturally still, facing the empty, dark highway, with his back just inches from her rear window. Sarah couldn't breathe. She didn't wait to see what he would do next. She shoved the gear shift into drive, slammed her foot down on the gas pedal, and fishtailed wildly, spitting gravel and ice into the air as she tore back onto highway. She drove at 95 miles an hour, white-knuckling the wheel, tears blurring her vision, until the sun finally started to paint the horizon pink. She never once looked in the rearview mirror again. Months later, safely back in Seattle, she took her car to a local mechanic for a routine oil change and tire rotation. 10 minutes after dropping it off, the mechanic called her into the garage bay. He was wiping his hands on a rag, his face pale and deeply confused. He pointed to the back of her car. Deeply etched into the thick, reinforced steel of her trunk lid, positioned directly in the center, was a perfect, life-size human handprint. It was pressed into the metal with such impossible, crushing force that the steel had permanently bowed inward. Story number 6. We eagerly invite complex technology into our most private spaces, believing unconditionally that it makes our lives easier, safer, and more connected to the world. But what happens when the very intricate digital system designed to protect you, monitor your environment, and lock your doors decides that it doesn't want you living there anymore? Alex, a young software developer, lived completely alone in a newly built, aggressively modern, state-of-the-art smart home in the sprawling suburbs of Austin, Texas. He had wired the place himself. Absolutely everything, from the heavy deadbolts and the exterior floodlights to the ambient temperature and the high-definition security cameras, was controlled by a central, AI-driven hub that he managed exclusively through an app on his smartphone. It was peak convenience, a bachelor's dream, until the house started making its own independent decisions. It started with small, easily rationalized annoyances. Alex would wake up shivering uncontrollably at 4 a.m. because the digital thermostat had forcefully overridden his settings and lowered the house temperature to a freezing 50 degrees. Recessed lighting and completely empty. Locked rooms would suddenly switch on at maximum brightness and then turn off at completely random intervals. As a tech guy, he brushed it off as buggy firmware or a corrupted software update. He routinely reset the main router, cleared the cache, and did his best to ignore the cold, creeping unease settling deep in his gut. But on a dark, torrential, rainy Thursday night, the subtle glitches escalated into a full-blown nightmare. Alex was standing in the warm glow of the kitchen, chopping vegetables and cooking dinner, listening to the rain pound the roof. Without warning, the central high-fidelity speaker system integrated into the ceiling crackled violently to life. It wasn't the usual pleasant artificial, synthesized voice of the home's digital assistant announcing an email. It was a low, heavily distorted burst of audio static. This was immediately followed by the distinct, unmistakable sound of heavy, wet, labored breathing being broadcast through the speakers. Alex froze instantly. The sharp chef's knife slipped from his trembling hand, clattering loudly against the stainless steel sink. He stood perfectly still, listening. The ragged, heavy breathing continued for a full, terrifying minute. Inhale, exhale. It echoed loudly through the speakers in every single room of the sprawling house, sounding like someone with ruined lungs gasping for air directly into a microphone. Then, the system abruptly shut off with a sharp pop, plunging the house back into quiet hum of the refrigerator. His heart pounding violently against his ribs, Alex grabbed his phone off the counter. He bypassed the main controls and dug deep into the smart home app's raw system logs, frantically searching for an external IP address, assuming some sick hacker had breached his network firewall. What he saw on the screen made his blood run completely cold. There was a second user profile registered and actively navigating his local network. It wasn't an external hack from a foreign country. The data showed the user was connected via the house's internal, localized wireless network. The profile name, created automatically by the system, was simply labeled guest. But the profile name wasn't the terrifying part. It was the activity log. The raw data detailed the guest profile's exact movements through the house over the last 3 hours, mapping a path. Guest access sub-basement motion sensor. Guest overrode an unlocked heavy basement door. Guest access living room panoramic camera. The timestamps painted a clear, horrifying progression. The entity, The intruder, whatever it was, had started deep in the unfinished basement 3 hours ago and had been slowly, silently moving up to the floors of the house while Alex sat on the couch above. His eyes darted to the final, most recent log entry, stamped less than 30 seconds ago. It read, "Guest Access Kitchen Lighting Array." The very second Alex read the words, the bright overhead lights in the kitchen instantly clicked off with a loud snap, plunging him into absolute, suffocating darkness. In the sudden, heavy silence of the pitch-black house, over the sound of his own ragged breathing, he heard something else. Coming from the end of the dark hallway, just 20 feet from where he stood, was the unmistakable, agonizingly slow squeak of the heavy basement door hinges easing open. He didn't grab his keys. He didn't grab his coat. He ran blindly, slamming his shoulder into walls, tearing the front door open, and fleeing into the pouring rain. He ran until he reached a well-lit gas station a mile away. He put the high-tech house on the market the very next morning, taking a massive financial loss just to get rid of it. He now lives in a cramped, century-old brick apartment building where the only thing smart about is the heavy, solid brass deadbolt he slides into place every single night. Story number 7. Deep within the sprawling, dense, and ancient timberlands of the Pacific Northwest, there are massive stretches of old-growth forest so incredibly remote and rugged that human feet haven't touched the mossy ground in decades, maybe centuries. It is an ocean of green. For a hardened, seasoned survivalist like Thomas, these isolated, unforgiving woods were the ultimate, pure test of human endurance. He planned a punishing expedition to spend 2 full weeks entirely off the grid, dropped into the deep wilderness by a bush plane, carrying absolutely nothing but a fixed-blade hunting knife, a magnesium fire starter, and the rugged clothes on his back. He wanted to conquer the wild. The first few days went incredibly smoothly. He was in his element. He built a sturdy, insulated lean-to shelter from thick fallen pine branches and expertly foraged for edible roots and berries. But as the sun set on the 5th night, painting the sky the color of a fresh bruise, the entire atmosphere in the ancient forest violently shifted. The usual, chaotic nocturnal chorus of chirping crickets, hooting owls, and rustling wildlife abruptly and simultaneously stopped. It was as if a switch had been flipped, leaving a heavy, suffocating, dead silence that pressed painfully against the eardrums. Thomas was kneeling, blowing gently to stoke the embers of his small, hidden campfire when he heard it. It was a single, incredibly distinct, heavy footstep crunching down hard on the dry, dead leaves, originating from the impenetrable blackness just a few feet beyond the edge of his dim firelight. He immediately stood up, his hand dropping to the hilt of his knife. He called out in a loud, firm voice, assuming it was a wildly off-course hiker or perhaps a backcountry park ranger checking on him. "Hello?" Come into the light. There was no answer, just the crackle of his small fire. He picked up a thick, burning branch, the embers glowing bright red, and held it high above his head like a torch, trying to pierce the thick curtain of darkness surrounding his camp. He squinted into the gloom. That is when his brain struggled to process what he was seeing. He saw the massive, ancient trees moving. They weren't swaying back and forth in a high wind. The thick, moss-covered trunks themselves seemed to be physically shifting along the forest floor, silently uprooting and rearranging their massive positions, deliberately closing in a tight circle around his small campsite. He rubbed his soot-stained eyes aggressively, convincing himself that severe caloric deficit and physical exhaustion were causing vivid hallucinations. But when he opened his eyes and looked again, the terror set in. The perimeter of his camp had drastically shrunk. The massive, towering pines that had been 50 yards away an hour ago were now towering over him, a mere 10 feet away, their rough, jagged bark illuminated sharply by the flickering flames. And standing perfectly, unnaturally still among the encroaching, shifting tree trunks was a figure. It roughly approximated the shape of a man, but its limbs were grotesquely, unnaturally elongated, perfectly matching the soaring height and gnarled thickness of the surrounding pine trunks. Its skin wasn't skin at all. It was a patchwork of rotting wood, peeling gray bark, and damp, weeping moss. Thomas didn't wait to see if it had a face. Pure, unadulterated primal panic took the wheel. He abandoned his carefully built camp, his fire, and his pride, plunging blindly headfirst into the pitch-black wilderness. He ran with reckless abandon, branches whipping his face and tearing his clothes, stumbling over unseen routes in the absolute dark, running until his lungs burned like they were filled with battery acid, and his legs completely gave out beneath him. When a specialized volunteer search and rescue team finally located him 3 agonizing days later, he was wandering aimlessly near an old logging road, severely dehydrated, delirious, and covered head to toe in deep, infected scratches. But the most chilling discovery of the entire ordeal was made weeks later, when rangers tried to locate his abandoned campsite to retrieve his gear. The exact, precise GPS coordinates recorded by Thomas's emergency beacon led them to a solid, impenetrable, biological wall of ancient, massive pine trees. The trunks were fused and growing so impossibly tightly together that a grown man couldn't slide a hand between them, let alone walk through. There was absolutely no clearing, no remnants of a lean-to, no ashes from a campfire, and absolutely no physical trace that Thomas or anyone else had ever been there. Story number 8. The vast, scorching expanse of the American Southwest is dotted with hundreds of forgotten ghost towns, crumbling, sun-bleached relics of the desperate silver and gold rushes that dried up and blew away with a harsh desert wind over a century ago. In the blistering summer of 2012, an amateur documentary filmmaker named Leo decided to shoot a solo project exploring a forgotten, unnamed mining settlement deep in the Nevada desert that hadn't appeared on any modern topographical map since 1920. The brutal drive took him 4 agonizing hours off the main paved highway, navigating treacherous, tire-shredding dirt switchbacks until he finally crested a ridge and saw the crumbling, gray wooden structures baking silently in the oppressive afternoon sun. The town was eerily, perfectly preserved in its state of decay. Batwing saloon doors hung precariously on single rusted hinges, and thick, antique glass apothecary bottles sat completely undisturbed under an inch of dust on rotting wooden shelves. Leo spent the entire, blistering day happily filming the silent ruins, capturing the beautiful desolation completely and utterly alone in the valley. As the sun finally began to set, painting the desert sky in violent shades of orange and purple and casting long, skeletal shadows across the empty, dusty main street, he decided to set up his sleeping bag on the elevated floorboards of what used to be the town's small wooden church. He unzipped his pack, ate a granola bar, and began reviewing his digital footage on his camera's small, glowing LCD screen before trying to sleep. The high-definition video was crisp, beautiful, and clear, perfectly capturing the eerie, tragic beauty of the abandoned settlement. But as he watched the slow, wide-panning shot he had taken of the main street facing the old general store, he noticed something impossible in the frame. Deep in the background, peering out from the jagged edges of a shattered, dirty window of the store, was a face. It was impossibly pale, gone to the point of looking like a skull stretched with parchment, and it was staring directly, intensely into the camera lens. Leo's breath hitched. He paused the video playback, his blood turning instantly to ice despite the lingering desert heat. His hands trembling, he pinched the small screen to zoom in on the pause frame. He desperately wanted it to be a trick of the glaring sunlight or a strange reflection on the remaining shards of glass. It wasn't. It was undeniably a person, standing completely still in the dark ruins, their eyes wide, dark, and utterly unblinking. The horrifying, crushing realization washed over him like a physical blow. He hadn't been alone all day. Someone or a group of someones had been silently, patiently watching him from the deep shadows of the rotting buildings the entire time he was filming. A primal, suffocating panic set in. Leo didn't bother packing his gear properly. He violently shoved his expensive lenses and sleeping bag into the back of his SUV, not caring about the heavy dark settling over the desert or the dangerous, cliffside roads he had to navigate to escape. He just needed to leave the valley immediately. He sprinted to the driver's seat, threw himself in, and slammed the heavy door, locking it instantly. As his shaking hands turned the key in the ignition, the engine roared to life and the bright halogen headlights snapped on, illuminating the dusty dirt road leading out of the town. Standing dead center in the beam of the bright headlights, completely blocking his only path out of the valley, was a crowd. At least 30 people were standing shoulder to shoulder in the dirt. They were dressed in tattered, filthy rags that looked decades old, their skin covered in a thick layer of pale, white desert dust, making them look like statues. And every single one of them was staring directly through the windshield at him with those same wide, dark, unblinking eyes. Leo screamed. He threw the heavy SUV into reverse, stomping the gas pedal to the floor. He drove backward blindly, tearing blindly through the heavy desert scrub brush, shredding his tires on sharp rocks and snapping small trees, driving completely off-road into the unknown desert until he miraculously found a different, dried riverbed that led him out of the valley. He abandoned the documentary. He never reviewed the rest of his memory cards, locking them in the safe, and he swore to never step foot in the desert again. Story number 9. The deep, brutal winter months in the northern states bring a very specific, quiet kind of isolation, a freezing, blinding whiteout that can sever power lines, bury roads, and cut you off completely from the rest of the world in a matter of minutes. For Emily, an introverted freelance writer renting a small, remote A-frame cabin deep in the woods of upstate New York, the incoming massive blizzard warning was a welcome excuse to lock the doors, stay inside, and finally finish her manuscript without distractions. By nightfall, the temperature had plummeted to single digits, and the snow was falling so heavily and violently she couldn't even see the outline of the pine trees 10 feet outside her living room window. The wind shrieked and howled like a wounded animal around the wooden structure, rattling the single-pane glass violently in their frames. Around midnight, with a sudden, final pop, the power grid failed, plunging the entire cabin into absolute, suffocating darkness, save for the faint, orange glow of the dying embers in the stone fireplace. Emily, feeling a spike of anxiety, fumbled in the dark to light a few thick emergency candles. She wrapped herself tightly in a heavy wool blanket, curled up on the center of the couch, and listened to the storm. That is when she heard the knocking. It was faint at first, easily mistaken for the storm. It was barely audible over the screaming wind outside. 3 sharp, distinct, heavy raps on the solid oak of the front door. Knock, knock, knock. She froze, the hair on her arms standing up. The nearest neighbor was at least 5 miles away down a private dirt road, and the snow was already 3 feet deep. Absolutely no one could possibly be driving, let alone walking, in these deadly whiteout conditions. She crept slowly across the cold wooden floorboards toward the door and pressed her eye against a small brass peephole. She saw nothing but a chaotic, swirling vortex of white snow illuminated by the porch light. She took a deep breath, rationalizing that it was just a heavy, dead tree branch blowing violently against the siding of the house, and walked back to the perceived safety of the couch. 10 agonizing minutes later, the knocking came again. This time it was drastically louder, more aggressive, more urgent. It shook the heavy door in its frame. Emily panicked. She grabbed a heavy, solid iron fire poker from the hearth, her knuckles white, and walked slowly back to the entryway, her whole body shaking. She stood a foot away from the door and called out loudly, her voice trembling, asking who was out there in the storm. A voice answered immediately from the other side of the wood. It was a woman's voice. It sounded frail, weeping, and utterly desperate, begging and pleading to be let in from a freezing cold. The voice sobbed, explaining that her car had skidded off the road into a ditch. She had been walking for hours, and she was going to freeze to death if Emily didn't open the door. Emily's natural, human empathy and maternal instinct flared up instantly, overriding her fear. A woman was dying on her porch. Her hand reached out and grabbed the cold metal of the deadbolt, ready to turn it. But something, some deep, primal survival instinct, made her stop dead in her tracks. She pulled her hand back. She realized what was wrong. The woman's weeping voice had sounded perfectly, flawlessly clear. It wasn't muffled by the thick oak door, and more terrifyingly, it was completely unaffected by the deafening, howling 70-mile-per-hour wind roaring across the porch. And then, as Emily stood paralyzed, the voice outside abruptly changed. Mid-sentence, it shifted smoothly from the desperate, weeping woman to the deep, booming, gravelly voice of a large man. But it was repeating the exact same words, with the exact same weeping inflection and pacing. Please open the door. My car broke down. I am freezing to death. It wasn't a stranded person outside. It was something horrible, something mimicking human distress voices perfectly, trying to bait her empathy to trick her into unlocking the heavy door. Emily backed away slowly, silently, step by agonizing step, never taking her wide eyes off the heavy wood. The terrifying charade continued for the rest of the agonizing night. The entity circled the small cabin for hours, tapping lightly on every single glass window, aggressively rattling the back doorknob, and perfectly mimicking the voices of children crying and men shouting for help. Emily sat in the dark, clutching the iron poker, crying silently until dawn. When the morning sun finally broke through the clouds and the deadly storm cleared, Emily cautiously unlocked and opened the front door. She looked down at the porch. There were absolutely no human footprints in the pristine, 3-foot-deep snow leading up the stairs. But deeply gouged into the heavy oak of the front door, right at her eye level, were dozens of long, ragged, splintered claw marks, as if something massive had been trying to dig its way through the wood. Story number 10. There's a very specific, deeply unsettling kind of isolation that comes with broadcasting your voice to hundreds of thousands of strangers across the world while sitting entirely alone in a tiny, heavily soundproofed, claustrophobic room. For 15 years, a gruff, veteran late-night AM radio host named Arthur ran a popular midnight to 4 a.m. paranormal talk show from a small, windowless, subterranean studio buried in the basement of a commercial building in the remote Nevada desert. His dedicated audience consisted mostly of long-haul truckers crossing the empty highways, lonely night shift security guards, and chronic insomniacs desperate for human connection. It was a live, unscripted call-in show, usually filled with people rambling about UFO sightings, complex government conspiracy theories, or just lonely souls who needed someone to listen to them in the dark. But on a quiet Tuesday night in late October, just past 2 a.m., the switchboard lit up with a single, highly unusual call. It bypassed the screener system entirely and registered as untraceable. Arthur, unfazed by weird calls, clicked the flashing red button on his massive console, leaned into his high-end microphone, and gave his usual upbeat, gravelly greeting. "You're on the air, coast to coast. What's your story?" At first, there was no response. Just heavy, oppressive audio static pouring through Arthur's headphones. It wasn't normal radio interference. It was a deep, rhythmic, wet crackling that sounded like an audio feed being broadcast from the crushing pressure at the bottom of the Mariana Trench. Then, a voice finally broke through the digital noise. It wasn't speaking in coherent sentences or answering his greeting. It was slowly, methodically reading a list of numbers. 4, 8, 15, 16. The voice was completely flat, entirely devoid of any human emotion, inflection, or breath, sounding exactly like an old, synthesized text-to-speech drone from a forgotten computer system. Arthur, thinking it was a prankster using a voice modulator, tried to interrupt, loudly asking the caller to identify themselves or he would cut the line. But the voice completely ignored him, simply continuing to read the sequence of numbers at the exact same agonizingly slow pace. After 2 solid, uncomfortable minutes of this, the numbers stopped abruptly. The heavy, wet ocean static returned for a brief, tense moment, and then the robotic voice said one single, terrifyingly clear sentence. "Look behind you, Arthur." A massive spike of pure, icy adrenaline shot straight down Arthur's spine, making his hands shake. He was completely alone in the building. He had locked the heavy exterior doors himself. The only way into the subterranean broadcast studio was through a thick, heavy, acoustically treated steel door that locked from the inside. But as he slowly, terrified, spun his heavy leather broadcast chair around to face the entrance, his heart leaped into his throat. He saw that the small, rectangular, double-pane viewing window set into the heavy steel door was completely blocked out. Something was pressed incredibly tightly against the glass from the dark hallway outside. It was a face. It was completely pale, sickeningly white, and entirely featureless. No eyes, no nose, no mouth, just a blank canvas of flesh. Its skin was smearing thick, dark, oily grease against the outside of the glass as it writhed silently against the door. Arthur panicked. He slammed his fist down hard on the big red emergency broadcast cutoff switch on the console, instantly plunging the massive radio station into complete dead air across 3 states. He scrambled out of his chair, threw himself onto the carpeted floor, and shoved himself deep under the heavy wooden desk. He pulled his knees tightly to his chest, wrapping his arms around his legs, his heart hammering against his ribs so violently he thought he was having a heart attack. He waited in absolute, agonizing, suffocating silence for 4 hours in the dark, straining to listen for the metallic click of the heavy steel deadbolt turning. It never did. When the morning production crew finally arrived to prep for the early show at 6 a.m., they had to unlock the studio door from the outside. They found Arthur still huddled tightly under his desk, completely catatonic and unresponsive. They had to call an ambulance to carry him out. When the furious station manager reviewed the high-definition security cameras for the basement hallway right outside the studio to find the prankster, his blood ran cold. The footage showed the hallway had been entirely empty all night long. The motion sensors hadn't tripped once. No one had entered the building, and no one had walked down that hall. But when the manager walked back down to the studio and looked at the heavy steel door, he realized the most horrifying detail. Smeared across the thick glass of the viewing window, written on the inside of the locked room with Arthur, in that same dark, foul-smelling grease, were the numbers for 8, 15, 16. And that brings us to the end of our journey into the unknown. The world is a strange, dark place. And sometimes, the things that go bump in the night are far worse than our worst nightmares could ever conjure. If these stories send a shiver down your spine, make sure you hit that subscribe button and turn on the bell notifications so you never miss an upload. Leave a comment down below and tell me which of these 10 stories terrified you the most, or share your own unexplainable encounter if you're brave enough to type it out. Hitting that like button really helps the channel out, and I appreciate every single one of you who takes the time to do it. Remember, the next time you hear a strange noise in the dead of night or feel like you're being watched in an empty room, it might be best to just pull the covers over your head, close your eyes, and pray it goes away. Thank you for tuning in to Late Night Stories. Sleep tight, don't look out the window, and I will see you in the next one.